Hello, my name is Sarah Aylward. I'm a senior lecturer in the School of Law at the University of Wollongong, which is located on the east coast of Australia, just south of Sydney. And thank you for tuning into my talk on Jane Austen and Me Too. I'm really pleased and delighted to be part of virtual JaneCon this year. I'd like to begin by acknowledging that I am recording this video and joining virtual JaneCon from the land of the Dharawal Nation. It is land that was taken by force, it was never ceded, and I pay my respects to the Dharawal custodians of this land, past, present and emerging. I'd also like to say up front that because this paper is in part about the Me Too moment, there's going to be some mention of sexual violence, though nothing explicit or in detail. However, if that's something that you might find upsetting or triggering, please take care while you're watching. My presentation is on the topic of Jane Austen and the Me Too moment. I research romantic women's writing with a particular focus on Austen and other women writers and how they represent masculinity. But I'm also a legal scholar, so I research feminist legal theory and history and law and justice as they relate to questions of gender and sexuality. So in that vein, I'm also investigating the legal resonance of the Me Too moment, particularly in Australia. Sometimes I research both of these things at the same time. This is my first attempt at drawing these two areas of my work on Jane Austen and masculinity with my work on the Me Too moment. So I'm excited to discover where this takes me, and I really welcome any feedback, questions, critiques or comments that you might have as a viewer. Okay, so the first area of my research is on the left, which is on Jane Austen and masculinity. This is the cover of my book, Jane Austen's Men Rewriting Masculinity in the Romantic Era, which was published with Routledge last year. In this book, I argue that Austen creates, through the courtship romance genre, a new model of masculinity that would complement the desire for feminine agency and selfhood that she embodies in her fabulous heroines. Essentially, Austen looked around at the ideas about what it meant to be a good man in the romantic era and decided that none of them would match the new conceptions of femininity that emerged at that time and which are reflected in different ways in Catherine, Eleanor, Marianne, Elizabeth, Fanny, Emma and Anne. So she created a new approach to defining the desirable man. And in doing this, I argue that Austen also advanced the courtship romance as a genre, because it needed more complex, more realistic and more compelling men that moved beyond the 18th century stereotypes. And I also highlighted that in creating this desirable man, Austen was in dialogue with a lot of other women writers of the period. Now, the second area of my research is symbolised in the photo on the right. This is a picture taken at a mass protest outside Australian Parliament House earlier this year. The Me Too moment has had a shaky foundation and quite a different trajectory in Australia compared with other countries. And we have not had anywhere near the same scale or severity of public revelations, partly because we lack the same protection of freedom of speech in comparable jurisdictions like the United States and the UK. And our defamation laws also make it particularly difficult to publish allegations of this kind. Straight after the global hashtag was ignited, Geoffrey Rush successfully sued the Murdoch press for publishing allegations about him in defamation law, and that had a really chilling effect on journalism in this field. And that was until this year, in which there's been a cascade of public revelations about political leaders and about political culture, and it has ignited a new grassroots protest movement, which we're hoping will lead to some tangible outcomes. So I like this, particularly like this post-feminism backed by popular demand because of its nod to the past, its recognition of a kind of a lull in mass feminist activism, and it contains a kind of implicit hope for the future. Okay, so how does Jane Austen speak to the Me Too moment? I've identified three threads that I'm going to talk about here that connect the way that Jane Austen rewrites masculinity to the Me Too moment. And this reveals, I think, in new ways how relevant her courtship romance novels are to the 21st century. The first thread is a sense of crisis in gender identities. The second relates to an explicitly feminine and feminist critique of masculinity. And the third is the call for a new model of masculinity that will promote gender equality. Okay, so to take the first thread, the idea of there being a crisis in gender identities. Now, Austen, as we know, lived through a period of extreme social and political upheaval. Her lifespan encompassed the French Revolution and its aftermath, the Napoleonic Wars, throughout which England was under threat of invasion, as well as the extension of that conflict around the globe, transformations in England's imperial expansion and its consequences for Indigenous people the world over, as well as changes to the Constitution of the United Kingdom and the Regency crisis. And a sense of crisis in gender identity, in dominant and hegemonic ideas regarding masculinity and femininity and relationships between them, was triggered by such rapid and drastic social and political changes, and in turn fed that sense of crisis and catastrophe. And that was the case for both masculinity and femininity. In fact, gender historians describe this period during which Austen lived as characterised by a crisis in masculinity. So by the time Austen was writing her Juvenilia in the 1780s, masculinity itself had become a topic of fervent public debate. Countless works of male conduct literature, like the one I have here on the left, the front cover of the Earl of Chesterfield's letters to his son. So these were printed and reprinted countless times throughout the 18th century, not just this book, but lots of others like it. And these then began to attract some controversy because of the potentially deceptive and fraudulent model of masculinity that it endorsed. It was then increasingly politicised in the wake of the French Revolution, the Napoleonic Wars and the Regency. And I have here two images from some of the adaptations of Austen's novels, and the army officer, Mr. Wickham, and the naval officer, Captain Wentworth, just to represent that idea of the nation being under threat and the consequences that that posed for masculinity. So masculinity was increasingly projected into discourses of English national character that were critical to Britain's military activities and to national survival. And in the context of the 1810s, when Austen was publishing, masculine discourses concerning refinement, work and professionalism, domesticity and nationalism and chivalry were vying for kind of social acceptance and cultural ascendancy. So in the way that Austen characterises men, she's not only reflecting this sense of crisis in defining what it means to be a good man, but she's actively contributing to it. And this period also, of course, witnessed the emergence of new forms of feminine identity, premised on a sense of agency, individual selfhood and desire for autonomy. And this is reflected in the work of several writers that I have here, an image of Mary Wollstonecraft, because her vindications of the rights of women is perhaps the best known expression of that, and the text that's had arguably the greatest lasting impact. The emergence and consolidation of the novel as a genre too, by privileging heroines, a feminine viewpoint, and placing the lives of young women at the centre of the action, had a profound and immeasurable impact on the emergence of new conceptions of feminine subjectivity. So the disruptive potential of these new forms of womanhood was signified by both progressive and radical proponents of equality between the sexes, like Wollstonecraft, but is also evident in the reactionary responses of conservative philosophers, commentators and novelists. Me Too, on the other hand, has not so much emerged from a crisis of gender, but arguably has triggered one, particularly in relation to masculinity. The image at the top on the right-hand side here is from the controversial Gillette advertisement, which was released shortly after the Me Too hashtag, which transformed Me Too from a movement that had been begun by Tarana Burke, in which victims of violence could support each other through a sense of solidarity and community. And it became a digital activism phenomenon as women, mostly women, but some men around the world shared their experiences of sexual harassment, assault and other forms of violence. The Gillette ad, playing on its slogan, "The best a man can get," and transforming it to "The best a man can be," was symptomatic in some respects of cultural and political shifts that questioned the desirability of dominant modes of manhood. The emergence of the Me Too moment has led many men, including those who have been called out and those who haven't, to reflect on their own behaviour towards women, which is symbolised in this photo at the bottom here. And the disruptive power of this is apparent from the emergence of the Not All Men tagline and hashtag and other points of resistance. What's important to draw out here is that Me Too is not just an attack on general structural inequality, the economic, social and political structures that support male privilege and block women's access to equality, although it is about those things too. Me Too is also about men and about dominant or hegemonic ideas, about masculinity, about what it means to be a good man, and indeed, in Australian parlance, the rhetoric of the good bloke. One of our former Prime Ministers came out a number of years ago and said, real men don't hit women. And the example, this is an example, the mass response was, yes, they do. So we are working towards changing the rhetorics, that it is not only monsters who commit such acts. And we're acknowledging increasingly that it's perpetrated by men who themselves identify as and would be influenced and identified by others as a good bloke. So in Me Too, we're witnessing a reaction to culturally influential rhetoric about masculinity that has protected perpetrators from being called out and has as much to say about bystanders who watch and do nothing as it does about perpetrators themselves. Okay. The second thread I've identified between Austen and Me Too is the idea of the feminine and feminist critique of masculinity. So through the courtship romance genre, Austen critiques, satirises, challenges and celebrates diverse and occasionally conflicting models of masculinity. And she does with the same forensic precision that she brings to her heroines and to her peripheral female characters. So as a novelist, her critique of masculinity is both feminine and feminist, and there are two ways that she does this. The first is by using the courtship romance plot. So the focus of the courtship romance plot is on the heroine's selection of a husband. And that inherently means that viewing men through a feminine lens is both a natural and indeed a necessary component of the courtship romance genre. Austen, however, takes this to another level in the way that she characterises her heroines and in the narrative techniques that she uses to convey that criticism, particularly focalisation. And I've chosen here two of my favourite scenes in which this is reflected. The top one is a shot from Northanger Abbey where Catherine Morland is out driving with John Thorpe. So this is where Catherine finally decides that even though she's been told by so many people that John Thorpe is such a favourite with women and he's so agreeable and he's so lovely, he's Isabella's brother and he's James's friend, that she starts to think for herself, you know what, I don't actually think this guy is that all agreeable. And it's the way that Austen uses her language here is she's just hedging Catherine's opinion so much, but she's determined that she's actually going to have this independent perspective. And in fact, Catherine's judgment in relation to men is spot on all the way through this novel. She clearly sees and ends up avoiding the mansplaining John Thorpe, who's interested in only male pursuits and only cares for the approval of his male peer group. She also identifies Captain Tilney for the sexual predator that he is, and she judges General Tilney for being the tyrannical mercenary approach that he takes to his household and his children. And this makes me think that, you know, although it can sometimes seem that Catherine fell in love with the first guy she met at a ball, she actually did see clearly who Henry Tilney was and why his man was desirable. And the second image I have here is not a very clear one, but it's the best I could find, is of the first proposal scene in Pride and Prejudice. And so in this scene, it just symbolises the feminist critique of masculinity so clearly, because we have Elizabeth Bennet, perhaps Austen's most strident embodiment of romantic feminine agency. She's telling a bastion of the landed gentry that he is not good enough for her. So this is a feminine and feminist critique of the desirable man, if ever there was one, and her rejection triggers Darcy's realisation that he must fundamentally change who he is if he's to be worthy of the woman who he loves. So Austen wasn't alone in using the courtship romance genre to critique masculinity, both through the courtship plot itself and also through the way that she presents heterosexuality. She was joined in this endeavour by a number of other women writers of the era, and here I've included a picture of Hannah More, a picture of Jane Porter and Maria Edgeworth, who each critiqued masculinity in their novels through a range of different lenses. Hannah More was particularly interested in evangelical masculinity. Jane Porter critiques masculinity extensively in her historical novels, and Maria Edgeworth critiques a lot in her national tales, particularly her Irish national tales. And in her fiction, Austen is in dialogue with each of these novelists, among others. And there's an argument to be made that rewriting masculinity in the Romantic era wasn't not just an individual, but indeed a collective pursuit by early 19th century women writers. Me Too is similarly led by women offering a feminine and feminist critique of masculinity. It's defined by women lending their voices en masse through digital activism to share their stories and experiences in acts of both individual and collective solidarity. Although Austen and other women writers tend to be focused on masculinity in the context of heterosexual romance, the family and the home, the Me Too moment collapses the public-private dichotomy and focuses a critical lens on men's behaviour, not only in the home, but also in all the workplace and all areas of public life that women now have access to, which women now have access. The power of Me Too lies in its amplification of women's voices and experiences, so that one woman's story acquires power through the connections the hashtag establishes with others. And this mass of voices arguably counters institutional and cultural practices in which women are disbelieved when they call out men's behaviour and speak the truth about their lives. This is an ongoing process, and we're yet to see how this will play out and what its medium and long-term effects will be. Finally, both Austen and Me Too are in search of a new model of masculinity that can promote gender equality. I've included here images of Mr. Darcy and Mr. Knightley from two adaptations of Pride and Prejudice and Emma, and I've chosen these male protagonists to focus on because they are the most stellar representations of Austen's rewritten model of what a man could be. So if we closely look at this new model of masculinity that Austen advocates, we find that it would, in many respects, meet the demands of the Me Too moment in the 21st century. And this is how I see these key features. First, Austen's ideal man is possessed of an internalised sense of self. So what I mean by that is that they are uninterested in performative modes of masculinity, which are associated with politeness, chivalry, or other ways of being a man that are essentially inscribed in the opinions or views or esteem measures of others. So this is something that Darcy has to learn in the course of Pride and Prejudice, and many of his misgivings about proposing to Elizabeth are because he has not yet reconciled his value for status and reputation and that sort of modes of social performance with his actual personality and his love for Elizabeth Bennet. Mr. Knightley, on the other hand, possesses this from the very beginning of Emma. The irony of his name is that he is the least chivalrous man of any of the men in the novel. So Austen particularly takes issue with performative approaches to masculinity because they invariably involve a gender hierarchy between men and women, in which men are placed in a dominant or privileged position in relation to women, and because they encourage men to seek men's approval rather than the approval or engagement with women. So in its place, Austen advocates a model of masculinity in which men measure their own personal worth according to an index of authenticity. So within this, being true to oneself counts for far more than the opinions of others. So relocating a sense of worth from social performance to external peer group status and achieving kind of esteem measures, to instead focusing on an internalized sense of integrity and authenticity. Men can thereby enter equal relationships with women because there is no longer a need for a gender hierarchy to support the external construction of a male persona. There is no need to seek the approval of male peers and to perform masculine privilege that essentially demeans and oppresses women. Each of these men is also deeply invested in calling out dangerous and toxic masculinity. And this is another lesson that Darcy learns in Pride and Prejudice with respect to George Wickham, because Darcy's insistence on dealing with Wickham in relation to Lydia signifies his realisation that part of his role as a good man is to call out and prevent the damaging behaviour of other men, and that his failure to do this because of his interest in peer group approval has caused harm to others, including the woman he loves. For Mr. Knightley, policing masculinity is really just who he is. He barely takes his eyes off Frank Churchill from the moment of his arrival in Highbury, and that's not only because he's worried about Emma, it's because he rightly identifies him as a potential source of threat or harm to others. These men also view women as moral and intellectual equals. Darcy is uniformly frank and honest with Elizabeth, sometimes in a way that is very rude and sometimes to his own detriment, because he has too much respect for her to engage in pretense of any kind. Their relationship is conducted wholly on their own terms, and the sense of intellectual and moral equality at the heart of this relationship is very clear when Elizabeth is reflecting on what being married to Darcy would really mean for her. It's at the moment when Lydia has absconded with Wickham and Elizabeth realises what she thinks she's lost. She reflects that she will get from him judgment, information and knowledge of the world, which she says is more important than anything she's going to give to him. And it's exactly what she needs to develop an even stronger sense of agency and personhood. Elizabeth has no doubt that Darcy will share his judgment, information and knowledge of the world with her, and nor should she, because that is exactly the way that he has behaved towards her throughout their entire relationship. Mr. Knightley is unfailing in his treatment of women as moral and intellectual equals. It defines his relationship with Emma, but it's evident in all of his relationships with the women of the novel, particularly his friendship with Mrs. Weston, and also with Jane Fairfax and the Bates women. And it's signified, of course, most clearly in his recognition that Emma's caring responsibilities are equal to his own responsibilities as a landowner and his decision to leave Donwell Abbey for Hartfield. In this regard, both of these men can imagine sharing power, sharing agency, responsibility and priority with women. And that might not have happened in Austen's time, and Me Too demonstrates other aspects of new wave of feminist activism. They reveal that it still hasn't happened in our own time, but Austen's formulation of a new model of masculinity is essentially advocating the same agenda in the Romantic era. So thank you for listening to my talk on Jane Austen and Me Too. These are my contact details. If I tweet at Salewood, that's my email address, and I have a website. If you do have any thoughts on this or you would like to get in touch, please do. And I hope you really enjoy the rest of Virtual JaneCon.